Hello and welcome to the second video about John Corbett. We left the last video with the Corbett family selling their canal business in 1852. However, I want to take you back to the 1841 census. It shows the Corbett family living in the Delph, and just a few doors along we find one Samuel Lester. Samuel was an engineer at Messrs Hunt and Brown of the Leys Ironworks at Brockmoor. John and Samuel conversed often. Samuel knew that John was passionate about engineering and had read many books. John was able not to just read a book, but digest it and retain the information. However, John knew that there was nothing quite like practical application, so Samuel introduced him to his brother, William Lester, who was the chief engineer of the same Leys Ironworks. It was William who took John on as his apprentice for the next 5 years. The Leys Ironworks were based at Stourbridge wharf, so John would have navigated past the works many times. He continued to live at home in the Delph and travel to the works every day. His time at the Leys Ironworks was mutually beneficial, as the firm needed John to apply his inventive brain to engineering problems they had. In September 1837, just 3 years before John joined the firm, their steam boiler exploded. One man was killed and several others were severely scalded and not expected to recover. The local newspaper reported that the site was devastated, and the damage was estimated at about £3,000. John worked in various departments within the ironworks to gain the maximum amount of insight into how all the separate areas contributed to the successful running of the whole company. During his time there, his passion for engineering enabled him to gain a detailed knowledge of the steam engines. He finished as a qualified engineer, which included mechanical science and business skills. This brand mark was used on the iron they produced at Leys Ironworks. When John was working with his father on the canals, one of the main commodities they transported was salt. In 1845, John became a commercial agent for the British Alkali Company based at Stoke Prior Works, and travelled to various places on the canal system, including London. Although John was still working as a carrier for goods on the canals with his father up until 1852, between 1845 and 1852, he was also working part-time at the Stoke Prior Works. He started work as an engine driver and then as an outrider, escorting and clearing the way for vehicles. He also worked as a cashier and finally became manager in 1852. By 1851, John was already moving in affluent circles. The census for that year records John as a salt merchant staying at Wollescote Hall in Worcestershire. He visited Stephen Hipkins, a wealthy brewer and maltster, who had bought the hall in 1848. It was around this time in 1851 that John moved from his family home at the Delph and was living on site at Stoke Prior. When the Narrowboat company Corbett and Sons disbanded, John didn't put all his eggs in one basket. He used some of his money to invest in various companies and real estate. But his main interest was the Stoke Prior Works. There were 2 salt companies based at Stoke Prior, either side of the Worcester and Birmingham Canal: the Imperial Salt and Alkaline Company and the British Alkaline Company. In the production of salt, both companies had struggled to cope with surface water seeping into the brine shafts, but they were also invested in producing chemicals and soap on the same site. Various schemes had failed, which resulted in the companies being put in the hands of the receivers. John reported at an interview in 1887 that the combined companies had lost a capital of £350,000. On the 9th of March 1852, John was granted a 21-year lease of the British Alkali Company at a yearly rent of £2,500. In an article dated 1887, John states, "I slept over the offices on the works, amid the smoke and steam, even descending the brine pits from time to time when apparently unsurmountable difficulties appeared. I never left the office." This image shows the clock and bell tower. Underneath were the main offices, and John slept in one of the rooms above them. John gathered around him engineers he could trust, and they sat down to work out how they would restore the run-down saltworks. Although these experienced firms had failed in preventing water seepage into the shafts, John was sure that he could succeed. He borrowed £70,000 to reline and reseal the brine shafts with cast iron cylinders. From the bottom of each shaft, a 3-inch diameter pipe was sunk several hundred feet further to reach the brine. Over the years, John continued to borrow and invest money to improve all areas of the industry and the quality of the salt. He also increased the amount of land he owned on both sites, until in 1867 he was the sole proprietor of the whole Stoke Works complex. In 1887 he had 30 acres of buildings, and his estates covered several thousand acres. Once the brine shafts were sealed, John needed powerful steam engines to pump up the brine from the earth. The wells varied between 300 and 800 feet deep. The brine was initially pumped into small reservoirs known as tuns. However, in 1872, a huge reservoir was built. Vast amounts of bricks were used to case the sides and bottom of the reservoir. The new reservoir could hold between 3 and 4 million gallons of saline, which equated to around 10 days' supply. John also constructed a smaller freshwater reservoir filled from springs in the area by means of a wind pump. The brine from the reservoir was piped underground by gravity to shallow steel rectangular salt pans measuring about 2 foot in depth and width and between 30 and 90 foot in length. By the 1880s, John had 100 of these large salt pans. The pans sat on brick walls with a fire chamber at one end and flues to transmit the heat to the other. In a bid to improve the quality and quantity, John painted in machine pans in 1860. These produced a superior quality of dense, fine salt. They were circular, about 20 feet in diameter, and had a conical cover to retain the steam. Each pan was heated by 3 furnaces. Inside each pan were a number of paddles on arms, which revolved through steam power around a central spindle. The agitation of the brine and the greater heat combined to cause a rapid deposit of salt, which produced very fine and hard salt crystals. The steam from the patent pans was piped off to heat nearby broad salt pans, so nothing was wasted. The process was simple. As the water evaporated, the salt rose to the surface in flakes and then fell to the bottom of the pan, where it was raked and scooped into wooden moulds. The moulds had perforated bottoms and were used to mould the salt into blocks. When the water had drained away, the salt was tipped out and carried to a drying stove. The blocks of salt were placed on a raised platform to dry and then loaded into canal boats or railway vans. John cut tributaries from the canal to his storage warehouses and constructed a railway track to navigate the works. He mainly produced 3 types of salt which varied in quality depending on its use. They were butter salt, used for curing butter and making cheese, table salt to flavour food, and broad salt, which was used for agricultural purposes, such as fertiliser and salt licks for cattle and horses. Some of the blocks were ground and packed in jars or cartons and sold as the finest table salt. Other tubs were sawn into cut lumps and packed in boxes for export. The quality was determined by the size of the crystals, which occurred through the differing temperatures. The higher the temperature, the whiter and finer the salt. As well as delivering the salt to places all over Great Britain and the world, John also needed to use vast quantities of coal to fire the furnaces. This meant that both the canals and railway network were vital to his business. It took 1/2 ton of coal to produce a ton of salt. The railways refused to supply vans for the salt, as the action of the saline particles on iron was very corrosive. So John set up his own ironworks, 20 foundries, sawmills, brickworks, fitting shops, and employed blacksmiths, carpenters, plumbers and bricklayers to work permanently on site. Clay was also in plentiful supply. He not only used it for the bricks and tiles to extend his works, but also to build houses. He constructed sheds on the site to build and maintain his 51 canal boats by the boat builder Samuel Shellard. Samuel worked for John up until his retirement in 1876, and then the Farrin brothers, George and Joseph from Northamptonshire, took over. The canal boats that were not powered by steam needed horses, so John kept stables on site for 10 horses. The first register of the Birmingham Sanitary Authority stated that the majority of his boats were used to take salt to London via the Grand Union Canal and bring coal back to Stoke, and sand and chalk for other industries in Oldbury. 2/3 of the masters of these boats were from Stoke Prior area, and the rest were from Braunston in Northamptonshire. John's boats carried 12,000 tons of salt per annum. His London agents, Weston and Westall, handled about 50% of the salt trade in the capital. I like the fact that you can see many railway wagons in the background on the embankment. These wonderful images were taken for a stereoscope to create a 3D perspective. This canal boat is one of John's and called Emma. The photo was taken around 1888 and clearly shows the Corbett name and Stoke Works on the side. Emma was built in the mid-1870s, so could have been built by either Shellard or Farrin, John's boat builders. In 1879, John Howell from Braunston in Northamptonshire was the captain. The photo shows John, his wife Elizabeth, and their eldest son John, who was 15 in 1888. It looks like Elizabeth is knitting. One of the canal boats registered on the 5th of February 1879 was named Joseph after his father. They recorded on the document, the method of propulsion was 1 horse with 1 cabin at the aft. By this time, John had 7 depots in London distributing salt. Although John was an avid supporter of the canal network, he recognised the value of the railways too. He built a shed to build and service his 1,000 wagons, and he built a track around the works, enabling the coal to be delivered direct to the furnaces and boilers. He also constructed a railway shed to build and service his steam engines. He named 2 of his engines Elephant and Raven, which were elements of the Corbett coat of arms. All of the vans and wagons carried his name. He became a self-supporting enterprise. At the end of the first year, when John took over the Stoke Works, 26,000 tons of salt had been manufactured. This gradually increased to over 200,000 tons per year. His salt works became the largest in Europe. In 1901, the Dictionary of National Biography reported, "He built up the most perfect system of salt manufacturing in the world. which is how he became known as the Salt King. In 1887, I found an advert testifying that John sold his salt to Queen Victoria, the royal household no less. This advert mentions the very many impressive exhibition awards he received for his salt between 1862 and 1894. Many cities are mentioned within the countries of America, France, New Zealand, Australia, Belgium, Holland, India, as well as in London. His awards were given for the superiority of his salt in colour and purity. He won awards for table salt, fine or coarse grained, broad salt, bay salt, fishery salt and butter salt. It was shipped from the ports of Gloucester and Bristol in bags bearing Corbett's trademark, a castle on an elephant, or from London by his agents Weston and Westall under the trademark of a black horse. John even advertised by having an embossed stamp on envelopes. I discovered 2 articles in the Worcestershire Chronicle in 1878 and 1879 giving descriptions about a forthcoming Paris and Sydney exhibition where John was showcasing the quality of his salt. This image shows the detail which can be done through salt carving. John commissioned an elaborate fitted case in black and gold, measuring 8 feet high and 5 foot wide, which held a finely carved, pure white trophy, standing about 4 foot in height and bearing the inscription, Corbett's Worcestershire Salt from England. It also included 2 smaller tablets engraved in an ornate scroll with the words Stoke Prior Saltworks. The larger piece also had an ornament in a floral design with the initials JC entwined. There was a lot of excited interest from various gentry who came to see it before it was shipped to Paris. From the top of the case, a coloured engraving of the saltworks was suspended, framed in gold, and lower down all his previous medals were laid out. The original graving is in the Bromsgrove Museum. The case was in black and gold because those were the 2 colours of the Corbett coat of arms. I am pleased to say that John not only received a gold award for the quality of his salt, but he also received a gold award under the category of mining industries. It was with some surprise and delight that I have recently discovered a silver medal for sale, which was awarded to John in an earlier Paris exhibition of 1875. The first image shows the medal with its case, and the second one clearly shows his name. The next video is about John's first home and all the different ways he improved the welfare of his workers at the salt works in Stoke Prior. All the references and with thanks to people can be found in the descriptions below this video. Please could I invite you to subscribe to my channel, to like and link to my videos and to share your comments below. God bless you and thank you for listening. Until the next time.